Hello, so my name is Robert Spencer. I'm here representing FIDIC, the Federation of International Consulting Engineers, and I also work for AECOM, which is a multinational environmental and engineering consulting company.
From FIDIC perspective, what were the main takeaways from this conference?
Thanks. So FIDIC, at the last COP27 in Glasgow, just prior to that, we published the FIDIC Climate Charter, effectively a sort of manifesto for engineering professionals as individuals, member companies and member associations around the world to sign up to in terms of climate action across their businesses and organizations. And so what I was really inspired by this last week, I spent most of my time at the Buildings Pavilion organised by UNEP and Global ABC, was the effectiveness of the sessions looking at decarbonisation and climate adaptation. And so from FIDIC's point of view, all of the activities that were happening there were super effective in terms of fulfilling the promise of the Climate Charter. And I think a lot of the participants in those sessions will be taking away a lot of good ideas, good practice, and be inspired by new approaches and solutions that they can then take into their work as individual professional engineers in terms of the commitments they want to make at a personal level in how they further their career and how they implement these approaches in their daily professional lives. But also I think I sensed a huge momentum, and a lot of talk has been about this at COP, of the non-state actors, in particular the businesses, stepping up and realizing that they can play a huge role in tackling both mitigation of climate warming and also resilience and adaptation measures. And to just give you one example, I was at a session last week on decarbonising buildings, and we were looking at standards and codes and performance measures there. And what was clear from the discussions is that a lot of the major engineering consultancy companies now, including AECOM and Arup and WSP and others who were represented at the event, are making huge efforts on a number of fronts. One, to have effective data available, so creating data lakes, data pools on carbon coefficients and KPIs associated with building. And that will be fantastic, because that will actually help us understand how we can measure and improve performance on reducing embodied emissions in buildings by at least 40% and hopefully more than that by 2030. And of course that's one of the major targets set out in the Breakthrough Initiative on buildings, which is one of the most amazing things to have come out of this COP process. And I think a huge number of stakeholders are getting behind that. Of course that means there's a lot of action to take at the company and individual level in terms of training, increasing levels of understanding of carbon literacy, increasing availability of tools and approaches to understand how to mitigate carbon on big engineering, buildings and infrastructure projects.
Okay, how did you just mention the next step, right? What is now needed after the COP? But is the sector understanding the urgency?
Well, yes, and I think one of the things that's really been a wake-up call was the status report on built environment that GABC and UNEP released just prior to COP, really concerning that we've actually seen an upwards tick in emissions in the built environment sector post-COVID, whereas everyone had hoped it would start to be going down in the other direction. And so I think that's a massive motivator. I think also that it's the first time this last year or so that we've really seen some of the larger players developing tools, data lakes, approaches, and actually sharing their approaches across different types of built environment assets as to how to decarbonize them and how to mitigate the carbon impacts of them. That we're starting to see a kind of a ripple effect now and a build-up in momentum. And so between now and 2030, there's going to be a huge amount of work, I think, to actually make it the norm normal practice to be decarbonising buildings by up to 50 to 60%, I think is appropriate during the design process. We know from our own examples at my company, ACOM, that 50 or 60% embodied carbon reductions can be achieved through a whole bunch of different approaches in terms of engagement with the client and alternative build options, different footprints, and so on. So I think that is going to be a huge amount of work required there. But I think we have one of the key things I took away is the tools, the data, the approaches, the understanding is there. It's really now simply a question, and it's not really simple, but it's a simple thing, is scaling and increasing the momentum through training. So one of the sessions I went to last week was with the Passive House Institute, and I was moderating a session there on how Passive House can be so important as an approach for not only new buildings but existing buildings in terms of retrofitting to reduce operational emissions. But then there's also been a huge amount of discussion on embodied emissions. One thing that I think is perhaps going to need more work that wasn't perhaps so addressed in the last week or so was infrastructure emissions. So transport infrastructure, not in terms of the operational emissions. There was lots of good discussion around switching to electric vehicle infrastructure, new fleets moving to hydrogen and electric. Of course, that's happening. But actually, how do you decarbonize the infrastructure development process itself? How do you reduce the carbon emissions in roads, airport runways, railways, and so on? And I think a lot of work needs to happen on that in tandem with making those infrastructure assets more resilient. And I think there's a lot of work for the FIDIC members and associations to do in order to build momentum around that. So I think that's another area that does need a huge amount of focus in the next 5 or 6 years.
Is there anything, Robert, you would like to add?
I think, well, one thing, yes, actually, yeah. And if there's one thing further that I would like to add is that I was really pleased to see the high-level expert group guidance on net zero for non-state actors emerging during COP as well. And I think this is a fantastic piece of work because it really provides some good handrails for all the non-state actors, businesses, NGOs, who are trying to do the right thing and reach net zero and decarbonize their organizations. But everyone wants to make sure that that's being done in the right way. No one wants to hear about greenwashing. And so this new guidance from the UN Climate Champions and a high-level expert working group is going to be so useful for others to benchmark their progress against. And I think it's also going to be a really strong momentum for umbrella organisations like Race to Zero, and one of the organisations in the UK that I helped co-found pledged to net zero for the environmental consultancy sector to sign up to science-based targets. So that high-level guidance is going to really stimulate and improve the performance of these working groups. And I think it will also aid a lot in collaboration in terms of setting out a route map to what's possible. Thank you.